On this edition of Bay Area Bountiful, we explore watersheds. First, we'll discover the science of watershed regions. Next, we'll explain how to best manage riparian corridors for water quality. And then we'll report on the various ways water flows into a watershed. It's all coming up next on Bay Area Bountiful.
Bay Area Bountiful is made possible in part by Rocky the free-range chicken and Rosie the original organic chicken. The Sonoma County Agricultural Preservation and Open Space District, Made Local Magazine, and Sonoma County Go Local. Support also provided by Pepperwood Preserve and through the generous support of the Sonoma County Water Agency. Cultivate, celebrate, connect.
The way water flows through the landscape has a large impact on how we use, collect, and manage this resource. Dave Kaler is the Executive Director of the Sonoma Land Trust and works with many organizations to protect and conserve the water in our region.
So in Sonoma County we have the Russian River Watershed, which is the largest, by far the largest watershed within Sonoma County. Then the Sonoma Creek Watershed, and across the hill from it around Petaluma is Petaluma River. The other thing we have in Sonoma County that's really sort of unique and wonderful to our county is we have these smaller coastal watersheds. And examples of those are the Estero Americano near Bodega, Salmon Creek, Russian Gulch, and you get up further north on the very border of Sonoma County, the Walala River, which is a substantial watershed in and of itself.
In previous episodes of Bay Area Bountiful, we've talked about rivers and streams, about where our drinking water comes from, and about groundwater. Now we're going to look at how all those things are parts of a larger system, a watershed. What is a watershed?
The definition of a watershed is an area of land where water drains under it and over the surface of it all flows to a single point. Rain falls on the landscape, and when it falls on a ridge, if it goes one way, it's in one watershed. If it goes the other way, it's in another. It erodes the weak rock and the dirt, and all that water collects in the low spots following gravity and digs out channels we call rivers. All rivers drain to a single point, as I said. In 99% of the cases, that's the ocean or a sea or somewhere. And then in a few cases, like Great Salt Lake, a lot of the water falling on the Wasatch Mountains outside of Salt Lake drains into a terminal lake. There's no off-ramp to or exit ramp to the ocean there. And to kind of get a mind's eye picture of what a watershed looks like, it's helpful to think of the kid's stick drawing of a tree where you have a main trunk and branches. That very much is what a watershed looks like, with the small branches being little gullies and creeks, and that going into bigger branches being the larger creeks or small rivers, and then on into the trunk, which is usually your main stem river.
Watersheds can be as small as an inland lake or a single county. Or they can be thousands of square miles, areas spanning multiple states and containing a variety of water features. Now that we're familiar with what a watershed usually looks like, let's see how all this fits into a local example. The Russian River Watershed. The Russian River Watershed is 1,485 square miles of land, 110 to 120 miles of river, containing 238 streams and creeks.
The Russian River is such an important resource for our community, and it flows up from the Potter Valley, Redwood area in Mendocino County, down all the way through the Alexander Valley, coming in and takes a loop out to the community of Jenner on the coast. That whole segment is what we have to take care of. And you have sub-watersheds like Marquess or Dry Creek or Green Valley. These are areas that capture water through the creeks and tributaries to the Russian River. Outside the Russian River Watershed in Sonoma County, you have two other large watersheds that we need to care for, which is the Petaluma Watershed and the Sonoma Valley Watersheds that flow into San Francisco Bay. But clearly, the Russian River is what defines this region.
Looking at the geology and topography of our area helps us understand how this watershed formed. The Russian River drains into the ocean at Goat Rock Beach in Jenner, California.
Here behind me we have the mouth of the Russian River. The geology around the Jenner area, we're standing here at Goat Rock State Park, and Goat Rock is just to our south. The river is where it is today because that was the weakest point in the geology where the water had the easiest time eroding the land and finding its way to the ocean. Here in California, earthquake faults are a major shaper of watersheds. The Russian River is 110, 120 miles long, depending on who you ask. And for about 80 miles of that, it flows north-south. And the reason it does that is those are basically valleys that are being pulled apart by earthquake faults. And so the water following gravity ends up in the bottom of those valleys, which has shaped its direction. And all that used to flow to the San Francisco Bay millennia ago. And the water found a weak spot between Forestville on the other side of the ridges here and Jenner, and decided to make a westward turn in Forestville and find its way to the ocean. And again, that was something that was influenced by geology, water eroding the softest material it can find. Here where the water meets the ocean, often you have features like the sandbar in the background here, which actually form an estuary, an area of slow water. This is a critical landscape feature which provides nursery habitat for both freshwater and marine aquatic species. And one of the best examples of an estuary in the West Coast is the San Francisco Bay.
What role does groundwater play in a watershed?
A lot of people think of rivers as the place where water flows, and it's not just the only place where water flows. Underneath the Russian River, underneath the Sacramento River, there's subterranean streams, and there's also basins where we have underground, essentially upside down lakes, and that's called groundwater. And a lot of times water, as it hits the hills, instead of coming down over the surface, it will find a crack in the ground or the rocks, seep underground, but it will continue to flow via gravity towards that river at the bottom of the valley. And that process can take days, it can take weeks, it can take decades. And essentially one of our biggest reservoirs of water is actually under our feet. You know, when we think about climate change and think about droughts and the effect they'll have on dams and things like that, groundwater, that water under our feet is going to become much more important.
We are connected to our watershed in so many ways. It's important to understand how individual and systemic actions affect the watershed we rely on.
As water managers, we have to be able to account for extremes. Flooding, multi-year drought, and everything in between. It's very important that we do our part to be able to respond to this challenge of climate change. We have systems in place that need to become more resilient, and individuals have to do their part to make sure they're using our resources wisely. And I think the next generation is going to have to step up even further and do their part to make sure that they are being as wise stewards as possible of this wonderful natural resource called the Russian River and all the creeks and tributaries that flow into that system.
The health of the watershed is the health of our water supply, and the biggest message we have today is that climate change, its biggest manifestation in this state will be the lack of water. So what water we have in a place like California is very precious, so taking care of it is critical, and that all begins with learning what a watershed is, your place in the watershed, and how you affect the health of that place.
The microenvironment along the banks of creeks, streams, and rivers is called the riparian corridor.
A healthy riparian corridor, you can just take a look at it and see it. Because it'll have healthy vegetation around it. There'll be a nice buffer around the creek or waterway. There's a lot of clues that will give you a sense as to whether the stream had a change in velocity and is in sizing in place. And that dramatically changes the way water moves within the creek. It'll either slow it down and allow sediment to drop out when it shouldn't, or conversely, if it might have tipped the scale on the creek and so water is moving faster and cutting more.
Riparian corridors are more than water flowing through a landscape. These essential areas, when properly functioning, help with flood control, contribute to aquifer replenishment, aid in carbon sequestration, and provide habitat for diverse wildlife. But 95% of California's floodplain riparian habitat has been lost. In Sonoma County, land conservation organizations, local landowners, and others cooperate with water agency Sonoma Water to protect, repair, and expand crucial riparian corridor ecosystems. The Sonoma County Agricultural Preservation and Open Space District has worked for years with local landowners to create voluntary riparian conservation easements while acquiring property in and around the Marquess Creek.
Marquess Creek is unique in that it is one of the largest tributaries to the Russian River, along with Maakama Creek and several of other large systems that flow to the Russian River. Marquess is also really important because it is a coho stream, and coho salmon are federally listed as endangered. So we're standing in an area that is critically important for the recovery of coho salmon, as well as the continued viability of steelhead trout. Marquess Creek is a wonderful part of our water supply, naturally filtering our drinking water, but it also helps with flood control. The Marquess Creek Watershed is perched above the city of Santa Rosa, and when these systems are healthy and can absorb water through these wide riparian corridors, they're less likely to deliver high volumes of water downstream really quickly, causing flooding.
The Marquess Creek riparian area was recently transferred to Sonoma County Regional Parks, which will steward the 1,100-acre Marquess Creek Park and Preserve.
We're 20 minutes from downtown Santa Rosa, and you are experiencing, just feel the vibe here. It's absolutely, you feel like you're in the mountains far, far away. And so to have that opportunity for people to connect with and understand riparian systems, but to tell that story to people, why do coho salmon come here? Why does steelhead come here? And to appreciate the beauty of this place, I think is just a fantastic opportunity for us. My father was a lifelong fisherman, and it was only one day when he was hiking down along a creek and saw an interpretive panel on riparian areas that he came back to me. He's like, "Melanie, do you know how important riparian areas are?" And I was like, "Yes, Dad, yes." So we want to have people have those epiphanies out here, right? Where they're learning that this isn't just water flowing through a landscape. This is actually a really vital part of our ecosystem.
Marquess Creek is part of the coho recovery plan, which has been developed by NOAA and the Water Agency and many other partners to bring coho salmon back to the Russian River watershed.
Riparian areas are also super important for terrestrial connectivity, so they become the pathways by which many terrestrial animals travel.
We're surrounded by the area that burned in the October 2017 fires. The riparian corridor came through that relatively intact, really didn't burn, and it acted as a buffer for the fires, and that's true throughout the landscape of these riparian corridors. But even the remaining areas that did burn are starting to recover really quickly.
These vegetation types have evolved with fire, and very much as the result of human ignition over time, over thousands of years. You know, we are at Sonoma County Regional Parks working with CAL FIRE and many other partners to relearn the tool of prescribed fire, which is something our indigenous peoples used routinely in these landscapes.
Sonoma County Water Agency, or Sonoma Water, has intakes right at the confluence of this creek system, Marquess Creek, and the Russian River, and that's where they draw naturally filtered water out of this watershed to supply clean drinking water for our community. I think one of the most valuable assets that Sonoma Water brings is that they have an understanding of how natural systems help us to protect and maintain our water quality and water supply. They don't just approach quality and quantity of our water supply through the lens of an engineering perspective. They look at it through the lens of natural watershed protection, land conservation, and stewardship. We're really fortunate here in Sonoma County that there's such a close collaboration and partnership between Sonoma Water, Sonoma Ag and Open Space, and Sonoma County Regional Parks, as well as our resource conservation districts, our tribes, and various nonprofits and private landowners.
This watershed that we live and work in is carved up into many small parcels, the most parcels per area in the whole state. And so that means that there are a lot of individual landowners that need to be engaged if we're going to manage this as one watershed. Some people's goals for their land are in agriculture. Some people's goals are just to have a beautiful and comfortable place to live. And so we're always looking for what is the thing that will help enhance their lifestyle or their business on their land and also help natural resources.
A healthy stream or river needs room to flow freely, to meander over time, and to overflow into its floodplain when necessary. Riparian corridors are much more than water flowing through a landscape.
They're critically important for supporting biological diversity. They help us be resilient to drought because we have a year-round source of water. They help us be resilient to flooding, and they help us be resilient to fires by acting as a buffer.
Healthy watersheds are storing water. They're providing clean water to us. Every day when you turn on your tap, you should think of a riparian area near you.
How water reaches a creek or stream has an impact on the health of that watershed and is as important as the physical aspects and geography of the waterway.
The way that you garden, using organic and healthy things that you place in your garden, all the rain coming down turns into runoff, and stormwater runoff enters into our creeks and waterways. So just being very mindful. The largest contributor to degradation of our creeks and waterway systems is sedimentation from erosion. So the farming practices that, for example, the best practices along vineyards in terms of growing cover crop in between the vines, and you often see that in our organic and biodynamic farms where the plant material is providing a healthy place for insects, is providing a healthy place for the farm. That is really healthy for the creek.
We have four main rivers in Sonoma County. We have the Walala that forms our northern boundary with Mendocino County in the most rural part of Sonoma County. We have the Russian River basin that obviously comes down from the Ukiah area down through Cloverdale, Healdsburg, Santa Rosa, heading through the middle and lower reaches out to Jenner and the ocean. We have Petaluma Valley, which drains to the Petaluma River, which is actually a coastal slough, but called a river, and Sonoma Creek over in the Sonoma Valley, also a coastal slough. So the County of Sonoma, primarily through Permit Sonoma, is the coordinating agency for all county departments that deal with stormwater, works in concert with the Regional Water Quality Control Board to ensure that public outfalls and private outfalls into our water courses properly screen stormwater before it enters the waterway. It's a large task that involves many points of input into the watershed. We are participating in a $1 million grant with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the State Department of Water Resources to evaluate how we can better filter stormwater from public rights-of-way before it enters local water courses. That process, that first phase, will be done next year.
So one of the most important elements of ecological landscape design is dealing with the water that falls on our site. Most often, or traditionally rather, it's been plumbed off site as quickly as possible. But what we need to do is we need to slow it down and percolate it through our landscapes. Otherwise, our creeks are receiving way too much water and they're constantly being eroded. And we can handle much of that by slowing that water down and dealing with it on our site.
Well, one of the things after the fire, and this is hopefully where we're going to end up having more fires, and so just being aware of what's in our home, and that everything in our home, if that burns, becomes air that we breathe, all those toxins, all those neurological inhibitors, and it will eventually settle down and enter our water. And so when you see very steep slopes that go straight into a waterway, you can always associate that with all of that would be rushing into your waterway if it's designed improperly. So you want to be able to break that up so the water doesn't just rush into the water system, and that you actually slow it down, spread it, and sink it. That's kind of a really common kind of good catchphrase: slow it, spread it, sink it. And you can use things like wattles, which were used a lot after the fires. The whole teams of volunteers laid about 35 miles of wattle with Sonoma County Conservation Action and the Russian River Alliance. And what that is basically a giant straw. Looks like a giant piece of spaghetti straw. It's about 12 feet long. And you put it along those edges where the water would be running off really quickly and just enter creeks. And it stops it and catches it. And just like the water filtration of the soil, that straw will help filtrate the water and catch those toxics, especially right after a fire, when you've got all of our paints and varnishes and pesticides from the house running into the watershed. You can set up those wattles to keep them from running in. So there's lots of tools, but basically designing so that you don't have slopes going straight into a water runoff.
And we can clean that water by flowing it through landscapes, rain gardens, swales, etc. So on this particular site, we have a series of homes without gutters, so we have a gutterless system. So our water is sheeting off of the roof, coming down, and it lands on a diffuser, which are these rock strips along the side of the structure. That prevents erosion from happening both in the garden bed, but also for the pads themselves that the structures are sitting on. That water then slowly seeps into the landscape beds, and then through a series of pipes to adjacent and downslope landscape beds, that water is slowly moving through this soil and planting spaces, getting cleaned by the rhizosphere of the plants and the biological life in the soil until it makes its way to the lowest point of the project.
Then also if you're aware of washing your car and you've got all this filth on your car and then you put it on your driveway and then the rain comes and it washes away. So it's important to think about that when you're doing activities like washing your car and putting kind of toxics into the water system.
In truth, sustainability is the moral and strategic imperative of our time. If you look at our social and environmental crises, you look at the increase of fires and floods and droughts and hurricanes, you look at the climate reports that say we have barely a decade to effect significant transformation, using a lot less greenhouse gas emissions and using renewable energy, transforming our food system, regenerating nature, our forests and our rivers and our oceans. There's a lot of work to be done. So living sustainably in your daily actions is incredibly important. Getting engaged, building resilience in your neighborhood and in your community is important.
In Sonoma County, I think we have a responsibility to pass along well cared for creeks and waterways. And along with that is opportunities for our youth to get to know our creeks and waterways. So I would just encourage everyone to send your child, your grandchild to some outdoor education opportunity. There's lots of them. A lot of our partners offer summer camps or opportunities to get outside and see these places. And whether you're 2 or 98 or whatever, just get out there and enjoy it.